Tilea's Troubles, Part 87. To His Holiness Bernado Ugolini, most highly favoured of Morr, from your faithful servant, Brother Migliore. The end of autumn, 2403. I hereby and humbly present the conclusions of my research into specific aspects of the history of the Uomini Ratto, as commissioned by yourself, in light of the increasingly numerous reports of sightings upon the seas around, and even within the lands of, Tilea. Concerning their ships. The Uomini Ratto are not natural seafarers, but can it be claimed that any land-born race truly is? Perhaps the elves have perfected the art of maritime navigation more fully than all others, but even elven sailors must find their sea legs before growing accustomed to shipboard life. All vessels are subject to the vicissitudes of the seas, battered by winds and waves, pulled by currents, baked by the sun, and befuddled by the light of the chaos moon. Sailors of all races fear being embayed on a lee shore, or attack by corsairs, and there are none who are immune to ship's fever, the bloody flux, scurvy, or simple starvation upon a long voyage. Nevertheless, the Uomini Ratto must not be thought deficient in their mastery of the seas, for I have learned from the mariners of the Holy City and Porto Maggiore that the rat men's vessels have long been able to sail close-hauled on a bowline, indeed directly into the wind, being for the most part propelled not by sails, but by screws affixed beneath their sterns, extending through their vessel's bows, powered by blasts of sulphurous steam, made more forceful by the conjoinment of the mundane and etheric heat of their sky stones. This means they can bear down upon a prize from leeward as easily as windward. Furthermore, even their tenders and their lesser, lighter vessels, of insufficient worth to warrant such infernal engines, are most often galleys, and as the Uomini Ratto care not a jot if their slaves are worked en masse unto their very deaths, then they too can similarly speed through the seas, contrary to any wind, for several hours at a time, making it difficult for even the most weatherly of sailing ships to intercept them if they do not have the weather gauge. Reports of Uomini Ratto in the Gulf are on the increase, yet a good number of sailors admit there have always been such sightings, indeed suggesting that nothing has changed, and that distance, the mists, or the weak light of the crepuscular hours encourages tired, hungry, or fearful eyes to conjure a myriad illusions, some verminous. Although many a lost vessel has been blamed on ratmen pirates, it is rarely known for certain why any lone ship is lost at sea, for survivors from such vessels are few in number. Of those lost ships whose fates are known, the vast majority were travelling in a flottiglia, their losses thus witnessed, and few of those witnesses mention attacks by Uomini Ratto. Yet there are those who say that this in itself is evidential, for the ratmen are renowned as cowardly bullies, and as such prefer to prey upon weak and lonely prizes, which means no one else would ever know their fate. One particular curiosity concerning the Uomini Ratto seafaring is their reputed use of submarine vessels. No such vessel has ever been captured intact, but for centuries they have been reported and even known to ram ships. Whether or not these vessels are mostly propelled by turning screws or by oars, none can say for certain, although in 2286 the Viadasan maestro Romolo Oriema, apparently inspired by pieces of wreckage from just such a vessel, drew up plans for a submarine craft in which the protruding oars were made watertight using leather-sealed ports. He seems to have constructed said vessel, but nothing is known concerning whether his efforts proved successful. This lack of information might be due to the maestro concealing evidence of its failure. Or, alternatively, it is possible that the experiment was such a success that the schemata were thought too great an arcanum of state to be commonly perused. His rather dense treatise discusses many practical issues concerning how to let out or receive of anything without the admission of water, how to propel and direct without the usual advantages of wind and tides, or the sight of the heavens, how to supply air for respiration, how to keep fires lit for light and cooking, as well as some rather obscure scribblings apparently detailing the leather seals and what appears to be fin-ended oars able to contract and dilate as required for either pressing upon or passing through the water. The last of his pages shows a weight suspended beneath such a vessel to enable its descent and rising. How similar the vessel Maestro Romolo made was to the kind employed by the Uomini Ratto is, however, a matter of pure speculation, and so I shall desist from further consideration. Concerning the underpasses. In the library of the Palazzo Endresi, I discovered the texts your scholarly adviser, Stoldo Schiavone, remembered perusing during his youthful studies. One of the volumes was missing, but fortunately the volume with a chapter considering the Uomini Ratto's underground movements during the Great War nearly 2 centuries ago was present, and I scoured it for anything of possible importance. This I have transcribed here almost exactly as the original. Excerpts from Inicino di Donato's treatise about the Uomini Ratto Wars of 2212 to 2215, Volume 2, Chapter 6, concerning caverns, tunnels and the great underpasses. By the summer of the year 2213, it had become generally known that the Ratmen were emerging not merely from the ancient city sewers, as did their emissaries, assassins and spies so frequently during the past 2 murderous decades. Nor were they lodged en masse in cavernous holes before their assaults, nor did they march by night to gather in ruinous places, wastelands and swamps, but that they issued in strength and line of march directly from the mouths of great underpasses, being tunnels of enormous proportions stretching for many leagues beneath almost the entire length and breadth of Tilea. In early autumn 2213, the army of the Third Riemann Pact fought at the mouth of the tunnel to the east of Rimas, then also at an exit near Ebino. But in both cases, despite breaking the enemy's forces on the surface, they were prevented from penetrating the tunnels to any real depth due to the loss of too many lives. Such a sacrifice was considered a price not worth paying, for should the Uomini Ratto send another army through the tunnels, then the high cost of fighting underground could leave the armies left to face them critically weak. The mouth of the tunnel near Rimas was collapsed with the use of black powder, but this proved of limited consequence, for the enemy simply carved out another portal further back, upon the eastern side of the river Remo. This allowed the Riemann Pact to give battle at Stiani, where its forces were massed, in the summer of 2214, defeating and scattering a truly huge verminous horde, destroying their engines and burning mountainous piles of their corpses. The underpasses were not, as one might imagine, akin to brick-built sewers, nor even ancient, twisting, irregular caverns between which a traveller might squeeze through skewed crevices and cracks. Instead, they were tall and wide enough for an army to march in column of ranks and files. The following excerpt is taken from Chapter 2, concerning the enemy's armies. The Uomini Ratto fielded horde legions, with double or even triple the numbers of the Tilean armies they faced. These were divided into regularly sized, regimented bodies, scuttle-marching in strict ranks and files. Each such body was commanded by a chieftain, accompanied by a bodyguard lieutenant, several musicians with shrill bells, and the bearer of a ragged banner. Most commonly, the warriors carried long-bladed spears and round, iron-rimmed shields, being clothed in dirty rags with scrap plates of iron armour on their upper bodies and arms. Their natural proclivity to swarm, as might their tiny brethren when threatened by some cataclysmic event, such as a flood or wildfire, meant that they had an uncanny agility even when packed together in the closest order. They marched this way also, as closely dressed as a body of Tilean soldiers might be, only in the moments before engaging a foe. Here, Chapter 6 continues. The great underpasses, and the mouths they served, were tall enough to allow the passage of engines of war of considerable size. Some engines were propelled by strange mechanisms in which sulphurous steam was heated by shards of burning skystone to turn gears and consequently the wheels, as might river waters turn a mill wheel. Such was the unreliability of these engines, and the ever-present danger that they might self-combust or even explode, that they were most commonly moved upon the march by slaves. Both Uomini Ratto and their larger brute cousins were employed as beasts of burden, often together, so that while the smaller slaves were whipped to perform the bulk of the labour, the brutes were required to lend a more mighty hand as occasion demanded, such as when stuck in a rut, struggling through mud or upon an upward slope. When transported through the tunnels, it seems that the engines were invariably removed from the main body of the army, most likely due to the relative slowness of their lumbering progress, and perhaps also a reluctance to manoeuvre such unstable burdens in close proximity to the army's massed soldiers. Any sudden detonation would surely have sent a wave of fire washing along the tunnels, capable of immolating many hundreds among the huddled hordes if it were to reach them before its heat was sufficiently dissipated. Each engine, its slaves and matrosses, was governed by an engineer whose understanding was sufficient to coax his ward into destructive power as and when required. They often carried a shard of the precious skystone themselves, mounted upon a haft of iron, the function of which was unknown, but has been variously speculated to be either like unto a key, or be able to produce a spark with which to breathe life into the engines, or a stinging staff with which to berate and bully their underlings, or perhaps merely a badge of office to signal their own importance and professed mastery of the mystery of said stone. How the underpasses were constructed is unknown for certain. What parts near unto the mouths were inspected closely by miners showed some scattered signs of chiselling, more frequently a swirling form of scraping, while other stretches seemed to have been scorched, the rock surface part melted or glazed. Knowing the Uomini Ratto's predilection to employ mighty machines in battle, as well as vast throngs of slaves of their own kind, then it was supposed that either one, or indeed both of these methods, were employed to hew through the rock. It is presumed the passages linked to natural underground fissures, for where else could the vast quantity of debris created by their mining, howsoever it was done, be put? Some scholars suggested that it were possible that the rocks were carried away by slaves, and indeed there are ancient tales, many hundreds of years old, of entirely new hills appearing in the far northern region of Albu, although the stories claim, among other things, that they were made as cairns for the eternal repose of giants, or even that monstrous moles, dwelling 1,000 fathoms beneath the ground, had thrown them up overnight when they came aloft to breathe sufficient air to sustain them for another millennia. The ground of the underpasses was like unto a beach, part pebbled, part sand, which in itself gave several miners pause to wonder at how exactly it had come to be so. It was suggested that perhaps the ground was a by-product of the pulverising of the rock, or some sort of burning. The tunnel mouths at ground level were the extremities of the tunnels extending from the underpass. The underpass itself was thought to pass by Urbino, under the river Terrano, just before the river Bellagio branched off. Then, beneath the river Trentino, northwest of Scorsio, coursing on to the mouth of the river Remo, after which it corkscrewed up to exit through a sea-facing wall of rock. Other, more elevated exits required ramps to be made from the debris which poured from the mouth. How the whole was ventilated was never properly discovered, and it could only be speculated that there was some form of ventilation shafts, perhaps guarded by iron grills or the like, with apertures cunningly concealed from the upper world. Chapter 6, Part 2, concerning the collapsing of the underpasses. Having had such limited success in collapsing the tunnel mouths, the renowned maestro Abramo Ruggieri of Urbino was tasked with discovering a way to make the underpasses themselves impassable. He was chosen because of his successful engagements in great architectural works, such as redirecting the Via Aurelia to avoid the floodplains west of Astiano, and damming the river Riati near Terren to create an artificial lake, and his proven expertise in the construction of great, helical, grooved shaft screws with which to lift and direct water. He proposed redirecting an artificial offshoot of the river Remo to permanently flood a long section of the underpass, while also using fiery conjurations and gunpowder to collapse the tunnel in the western reaches of Ossola, southeast of Urbino. Thus, if either method proved unsuccessful, then the other might make up for the deficiency. And, should the Uomini Ratto discover one operation before it was completed, and devise some method to thwart it, then the same method could not be applied to the other stretch. Other city-states, including Miragliano, Trantio and Astiano, were expected to assume the responsibility of collapsing or otherwise preventing the use of any tunnels in their own proximity, and it is possible that different methods were employed at these locations. Both of Maestro Abramo's proposed methods proved effective. A torrent of water, drawn from the Remo, was poured through a large carved hole into the underpass and flowed freely for several days until it began to spill out from the hole, presumably because it had filled the entire tunnel length. Or perhaps the enemy had collapsed the tunnel at a removed point in order to block the water's further onrush. At that point, as had been planned, the Maestro ordered the damming of the Remo's outflow, so that the river might resume its usual course. Subsequently, a smaller channel was dug to ensure that the waters within the underpass would be replenished continually, thus replacing any loss due to flooding through underground fissures, whether natural or unnatural. To the north, near Urbino, several fire wizards were employed to conjure a magically induced wave of flame to wash along the underpass, where large quantities of black powder, both barrels and grenados, the latter jammed into fissures in the rock walls, had already been placed at both frequent and regular intervals. It was presumed that each blast would add to the wave of flame as it flowed, so that as the ethereally derived power of the heat dwindled, the fury of the mundane flames would increase in inverse proportion. Thus it was that the course of the war was changed considerably, for subsequently the enemy had to rely upon overland marches and the seas, and was much less able to conceal the disposition of their forces. I have copied here, as best my limited ability allows, the little map included in the chapter. Here the chapter ended. The remainder of the book concentrated upon the history of the Third Riemann Pact and of the war itself, mainly concerning the politics and rulers of the various Tilean states involved in the war, as well as a veritable cornucopia of stories concerning the nobility, some important and others insignificant, but of very little consequence to our world 2 centuries later. As you yourself wisely suggested, I discussed my findings, as well as all that I had learned from both the sailors and Anicino di Donato's other volumes, with the maestro, Angelo Daglioni. He allowed me to visit him in his workshop, where he was surrounded by books, papers, schemas and strange artefacts, the like of some of which I had never seen before. A large spherical globe of strangely hued metal gave off occasional stuttering clicks throughout our meeting, but neither the maestro nor his gnomish assistant paid it any attention. He clearly found my account fascinating, and was prompted to wax both lyrically and generously in sharing his own thoughts. He seemed most intrigued by the possibility that the Ratmen's tunnelling engines, if they did indeed employ heat to burn the subterraneous rock, as the evidence of scorching suggested, might be, in form, rather like the engine he gifted to the Disciplinati di Morr for their march into the north. That consisted, he told me, of lenses, both dioptrical and catoptrical, some of pure glass, and others of glass admixed with powdered skystone, being employed to separate, then concentrate, a conjoining of light, both etheric and mundane, vastly increasing the heat thereby manifested. Such an apparatus, especially if the source of ethereal light were not the distant sun, but a shard of pure skystone, of a size and form that would most likely bake the very flesh of anyone standing close enough to work the device, might indeed produce a shaft of such brilliant intensity as to burn away the rock, or at the least make it, to a depth of several feet, so brittle in consistency that simply scraping at it would subsequently cause it to crumble away. Yet he foresaw innumerable difficulties and dangers inherent in the employment of such an apparatus, not least the great cloud of poisonous fumes that he believed would be produced. Here he showed me several strange masks, hoods and sleeved cloaks he had fashioned, kept in a wardrobe in his workshop, intended to be worn at times of plague or when foul fumes tainted the air, and spoke of the possibility that similar garments might be employed to permit workers to labour at least for some time before succumbing to the noxious vapours. Yet still he checked himself, for he now declared such a sudden boiling, even of only the constituent part of the rock that gifted the quality of hardness, and its almost instantaneous transformation into vapour, would cause a great and violent onrush of air, at most explosive, and at the least like unto the strongest of gales. This would be forced unstoppably through the great tunnel, to be released and diminished only wherever vents pierced the roof to reach the upper world, which surely there must have been. Indeed, he proposed that such vents, placed at regular intervals, would have had different purposes over time, from allowing air to circulate sufficiently to make work in the tunnels just possible, then later allowing the necessary escape of the bursting noxious vapours. Perhaps some of these vents, he suggested, if only those most suitably placed, were then later transformed into the concealed ventilation shafts intended to serve the tunnel permanently. Before I left, and as a most gracious gesture to show his respect for you, Your Grace, he instructed his gnomish clerk to take a copy of a paper of consequence that might better inform natural philosophers and engineers of at least the basic principles of his burning apparatus, if not the full and complicated practicalities of its construction, which were more discovered and explored in the making and calibration of the apparatus than in any schema or drawn design beforehand. I enclose said page here. I remain, as always and evermore, your most humble servant, for you are Holy Morr's most blessed, and my heart knows only love for him and all those who serve his church.